Today, we are delighted to be joined by Ellen Gabriel for her lecture, Resistance in the Time of a Pandemic. Ellen Gabriel is an artist with a BFA in studio art from Concordia University, where she graduated in May 1990, and an indigenous human rights and environmental activist from Gane-Sadage. We are grateful to have her with us today to share her knowledge and experience. I will now turn to Ellen Gabriel, and I will be back for the Q&A following her lecture. If you would like to submit questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom or the chat function on YouTube for those who are on the YouTube stream. So Ellen, welcome. It's all yours.
Yeah, Daniel. Wat kun waratu sa kwego katita kosne yatstano waganyatu. Kanya kahagagya to tatano kanasata agenagere. Nyao ci daskungarao di sa unizerade. Ahando akataswa wakatunzoni ci tatitino warado nene sungwayetitu. Tano akwego nene akwego tatawanere. Yetino warado no ni yete istao hutsa. Mogatsononi ci daskungarao tano nyao ci ka amantunene skatne So thank you very much for inviting me. My Kanyakaha name is Katsitsakwas, in Speaking Flowers. I'm Turtle Clan from the community of Gane-Sadage. I'm Kanyakahaga. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I just said some greetings to the creation, natural life forces, and Mother Earth on all our relations. It's a very quick and a very short acknowledgement of all the life forces, all our relations that Indigenous people have always been grateful for, and which motivates a lot of Indigenous land defenders. Our ancestral teachings provide us with the kind of guidance on how to be stewards and respectful of the land and all that it brings. I'm going to be talking to you today about what happened last year and is continuing to happen during a pandemic, of how the colonial machinery and corporations' agenda, economic agenda, did not even hiccup when the pandemic was declared throughout the world as a year ago. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what that means as an Indigenous person, what it means, what the impacts of colonization have done, and how very little has changed in regards to how the rule of law has placed Indigenous people in the court system, and some of the things that keep us strong and resilient. So I have some slides to show you, just in case some of you have forgotten that last year, at the beginning of last year, there was a large RCMP raid of the Wet'suwet'en territory. And a lot of Indigenous people were outraged. Indeed, a lot of the public was outraged. And so this is just to remind you that 2020 actually started in a very big way for Indigenous people, even if the general public didn't notice it. But I'm sure that the government of Canada and the provinces noticed it. And in this one, you can see a red dress in the back, which symbolizes the murdered and missing Indigenous women from the economic agenda of the colonizer. So next slide, please. The heavy-handedness that the RCMP and police did in regards to Indigenous protests, you don't see with other protests. You see them coming in almost as if they would 100 years ago, and pepper spraying elders. We saw that in Elsipogtog. We saw that in Gane-Sadage 31 years ago, with actually firing upon peaceful protesters. So the history that we're talking about is based on a racist norm that saw Indigenous people as disposable, as less than human, because of papal bulls, like the doctrine of discovery, that allowed the the pioneers, you call them pioneers, I call them psychopaths, who came here from Europe seeking riches. And later on, as settlers started coming in, there was the Indian problem. After the War of 1812, I won't go too back in history, but after the War of 1812, settler governments realized they didn't need Indigenous people anymore to fight their battles with them. So they made the reserve system. So that's one of the 4 waves of colonization that has impacted Indigenous people. So legislation denying us our human rights, even though, as Beverly McLaughlin, Supreme Court Justice in Canada, declared that Aboriginal people's rights have always been human rights and have always been international. Let's go to the next slide. Oops, I think you missed one. Went really fast. So there's Frida Hudson. I don't know if people are familiar with Frida. She and her family, along with Molly Wickham's family, in another part of the territory, this is where they live. And they're protecting their home, just as many Indigenous people have throughout the centuries tried to protect their homes. And we see that, that the law, the rule of law, is not in the favor of Indigenous people. As one lawyer told me when I talked about our land issue in Gunsadage, right now the law sucks for you. That was the best way that she could describe the court system. There's been Delgamuck, which talks about the duty to consult. There's Haida, which talks about the honor of the crown, and free, prior, and informed consent, which has not really been honored. You have a band council system that works for the government of Canada, but is a service provider in the community. It cannot make decisions without it being rubber stamped by the Minister of Indian Affairs. And I'm going to say Indian Affairs because under Canadian law, under the one of the most, or the only racist existing racist act in the world at this moment in time, the Indian Act, we are called Indians. We don't have on our card Indigenous, we have Indians, because the Indian Act still exists. Next slide, please. And so right across Canada, before the pandemic was declared, there were railways that were being blocked. There was one here over here in Gunawaga. There was one in Payandanega. And the tension was really built really high and strong, simply because you have provincial premiers who don't know about human rights. They know about economic rights. They know about business and corporations. They know about healthcare, but they really don't know about human rights. So they're making these authoritarian decisions, authoritarian-like decisions, whereby they're going to decide what the rights of Indigenous peoples are without really looking at the international human rights standards and norms that Canada is obliged to uphold, and without looking at the historical part of their own constitution, which talks about the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. And if we go even further than that, the inherent rights of an individual. So the UN Charter and many of the declarations and conventions under international human rights norms talk about the inherent dignity and worth of a human being. For Indigenous people, we do not feel that. We don't get that vibe from Canada. What we get is that we are some kind of blight on the freedom, the democracy of Canada. I think many lawmakers, there's exceptions of course, would prefer that we had gone silently into the dark and just remain a footnote in history. For Indigenous people, we don't see us as being conquered, we see us as surviving genocide. And those of you who have ever read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report and calls to action, or even the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, you'll see that there are thousands and thousands of testimonials that talk about the threat to their human safety and well-being simply because they're Indigenous. And on top of that, being an Indigenous woman is even more precarious in society. Next slide, please. And this is one thing that I want to talk about. when we talk about green energy, we know that it does not mean sustainability. I'm going to be showing you a video fairly shortly that talks about, is addressing an issue in an Atikamekw community, which is about a graphite mine that is used for what else? Green cars, electric cars. There is nothing that we do as consumers and have in consumers that is green. The only way that you're going to be environmentally friendly is if you actually go off the grid. And with the millions and billions of people in this world, I don't think it's possible. Next slide, please. And one of the things about colonization is how it undermined Indigenous women's leadership and ability and authority. And so I wanted to show you a picture of some of the women that have been out there. And, you know, you see the snow. We know how cold our winters are. And so when Indigenous people go out on the, to do blockades, it's not very comfortable. We'd rather be home in our living rooms, either reading a book, watching TV, or spending time with our families. And Indigenous women have been the backbone of making changes, legislative changes in Canada and in the world, actually, simply because their vision of the future and present is really about families. So I want to honor all those Indigenous women out there who have been leaders. Some that come to mind are Mary Tuax Early, who helped change the Indian Act. Sandra Lovelace, who's a senator, and some of the younger leaders like Arielle Deranger and Melissa Mullen Dupuis. So I want to honor them, especially since the other day was Indigenous International Women's Day. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I find is talk about fake news. So the government pretends to send somebody who they think is going to be able to be gentle and smooth talk Indigenous people after the fact that they've talked to the band councils and the band councils have said, okay, it's fine. And I don't want to generalize, not all band councils are that way, but the band council system is a colonial entity. It's created by the government of Canada. And so a lot of land defenders are not very comfortable under the band council system besides providing services. And so in Tyendinaga, there was a lot of controversy because of the blocking of rails. I'm sure a lot of you remember. And so they go through the motions for the public to show that they're trying to be reasonable with these radicals. Meanwhile, they're the ones who are violating their own rule of law by not respecting the treaties, by not respecting our right to self-determination. And our right to self-determination includes so many things. The freedom to enjoy our languages, our culture, access to our lands, and so many things that are part of self-determination for any group of people that considers themselves sovereign. So I'm wondering if we could just play a clip right now of the Atikamekw protest. It's in French. For those of you who don't understand French, we can talk about it, but it's very simple.
La planète. On veut empêcher les coupes forestières. On veut demander une moratoire de 5 ans sur nos territoires. J'ai besoin de tout le monde, soit blanc, noir, jaune, vert, je sais pas, tout le monde pour sauver la terre.
So thank you, Blair, for showing that. So that's from Franklin Lopez, who is also working with the Wet'suwet'en Nation to highlight what is going on their territory. I'm just seeing McGill's pathway there, so I don't see my slides anymore. There it is. All right. So the next slide, if you don't mind. So that's a little bit more of when the police decided to go in and make arrests of people at the rail line. And this is it was a very controversial blockade because of some of the actions which came out of anger from a lot of them, because witnessing people being brutalized by police, you know, when they're your family members and their community members, this is when we come together as a people. And some might have disagreed with tire burning and all that stuff, but when the police come in, I think generally people feel that we are all being attacked and we're all being threatened. And so this was a very difficult time. I was there a day or two just before that raid, and it was getting very, very tense in the community. And it was very strong people, Kanien'kehá:ka people, who stood up in support of the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia. So I just wanted to also remind people that this is just before the pandemic is officially declared. Okay, next slide, please. Again, that's another, so you have like 1, 2, 3, 4 officers, if not more, sometimes even more, on one person. So is that really necessary? No, it's not. And so we see, you know, as Indigenous land defenders, what we see the police being is the corporation's police. They're not the police of the people. They're there for the corporations who are making money off of everybody. And it angers people, and understandably so. Next slide. And this is, I was surfing the web and trying to find some of the images that you've seen. And it ranged from Japan to Europe to even China. Some of these images that talked about what was going on in Canada. And you have to understand as well that it's not the government of Canada alone that is doing this. There are a lot of foreign multinationals who are coming in, mining, not just the tar sands and not just development, but all kinds of hands are in the pie. And as Indigenous people, we do not have the resources to be able to fight back against these multi-corporations, billion-dollar corporations, and take them to court, a court that does not recognize or respect our rights or narrowly views our rights, a court system that still is based on the racist norms of the doctrine of discovery, and that we are wards of the state. So it's really, really difficult. And I'm really happy that this went worldwide, but here we are on the March 10th. And we're not even close to resolving any of the issues that we saw happen last year. Next slide, please. And so this is here in Kahnawake, and again, this is just before the declaration of the pandemic, and right near the Mercy Bridge. And this is when Premier Legault was accusing the Mohawks, who he labels all warriors, but Mohawks as terrorists and criminals with AK-47s or whatever you want to think of as weapons. And you know, for communities, when you attack a community and you attack a group of people like that, that to me proves that there's systemic racism. It goes to me that there's a lack of education, which the Truth and Reconciliation talked about, that everybody needs to be educated on the history, the colonial history of Canada. And for some reason, people like Premier Legault think that these do not exist in Quebec, because Quebec was oppressed by the English and all this kind of nonsense, rather than looking at it as a human rights thing, and that we need to support one another. As Indigenous people, we're what? I think we're like more like 10% of the population. So we're not the majority anymore as we were at one point in time. And so when we see things that are unjust, we need to support each other. Next slide, please. So that's just another image from Tyendinaga. And this is the mantra of many Indigenous people, land defenders, is stop colonization. Next slide, please. And so when I saw this is at the in the Stoughton camp, and you can see the police on one side, and they've marked, and some people have marked the red dresses and the sign of reconciliation. So is this what it really means? I think actually the police are on the other side. Next slide, please. And then we move to the summer. Actually, this is the fall, I believe, with the lobster fishing, the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers, their buildings being burnt to the ground. And at one point, I think it's the next slide. I think at one point, the next slide, please. At one point, there's a friend of mine holding the sign "Treaty Lobster for Sale." So I think there was a few well-known restaurants that were buying lobsters from the Mi'kmaq people, and we see that this was, people keep telling Indigenous people, go to the Supreme Court or go to court to get your rights recognized or respected. Even when we go, as is evidenced with the Mi'kmaq lobster fishermen, it's not respected, it's not implemented. And so it's very crazy making for us, because we know that we have no choice. This is not an option for us to go to the courts, but this is what we're forced into. We are coerced into Canada's court system that doesn't respect our rights. And we don't have an option when it comes to protecting our livelihoods, our lands, and our way of life and our languages. We don't have a choice. Some people can choose to ignore it, but at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult. Next slide, please. And last summer, myself and a few other people from the community observed the archaeological digs in Gunnesadage, but people call it Oka. And this is part of the last part of the urbanization plan that Oka has in regards to creating the kind of landscape that they desire. And so we were there, and this is ironic, but the SQ were our friend that summer. And they were very helpful to us in a very strange way. I was very surprised. But they tried to mediate between us and the municipality of Oka and the mayor of Oka, who is claiming land that is not his to claim, and Oka's claiming land that is not theirs. So the pines that we fought for in 1990, they're trying to claim as their cultural heritage site, which is, again, based on a racist ideology that this land belongs to them simply because they have the laws on their side. And the next slide. And so we kind of ended that year with a very horrific act that was recorded by the person that you see on the screen, Joyce and Shekwan, an Atikamekw woman, a mother, a daughter, a wife, who faced systemic racism at a hospital, I think in Litsuk. And so there were big demonstrations in Montreal, which I attended as well. And to this day, her family came up with Joyce's principles, something like Jordan's principles, which is basically that every person has a right to good health care without racism, without discrimination. And the Premier of Quebec, Mr. Legault, and Ian Lafrenière, the former police officer who is now the Minister of the Secrétariat des Affaires Autochtones, has said, there's no systemic racism in Quebec, so we're ignoring Joyce's principles. So every time we want to reach out for reconciliation, and which it should be accompanied by restitution, legally that is the process. We are hit and not blindsided, but we are hit by a racist attitude, by government, by a culture of bureaucracy that is very sadistic. I find there's no other word to describe it other than being sadistic. And so we witnessed something that should never have happened. Joyce should have still been alive today had she gotten the proper treatment, had she been treated with dignity and respected. And so I wanted to also honor the memory of Joyce Echaquan as well. So I think I have one more slide and then I'll talk a bit and then we can go on. So this is one of the young Indigenous women leaders, part of the head of Indigenous Climate Action. So I'll just read the quote for you. Our people and our Mother Earth can no longer afford to be economic hostages in the race to industrialize our homelands. It's time for our people to rise up and take back our role as caretakers and stewards of the land. Arielle lives in Edmonton, but she is comes from one of the communities that, Fort Chip as they call it, that is directly affected by the extractive industry of the tar sands and whose land has been destroyed by the tar sands. So I'm just going to talk a little bit and then I think we can open it up for some questions. So I don't know if you see me on the screen or how this works. Anyhow, colonialism is not really well understood by people. And I think it was pretty evident the fact that colonialism is a big machine. While everybody was told to hunker down, while scientists were trying to figure out what COVID-19 was, construction was still going on. Man camps were growing bigger and bigger. They were spreading this disease to small northern communities in British Columbia. The police still brutalized Indigenous people. For a long time, not until Black Lives Matter in the US with the murder of George Floyd, did people around the world realize we can protest. We'll wear our masks, we'll try to distance, which was an impossible thing. But we're going to protest because there has been no slowing down of the craziness of development, of the craziness and the attitude and this greed that we see, which is the foundation of many societies, rather than helping each other out and saying, let's take a break, as the gentleman from Manawan said, we need everybody to help us protect the earth. We need everybody, whether they're red, white, black, or green, as he said it. We need everybody to get involved in this. And that's what Indigenous people have been asking for a long time. Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth, said that colonization distorts the past of the colonized people. It distorts it, it disfigures it, and it destroys it. And the resources used to achieve this cultural alienation is to convince Indigenous people that they will save us from the darkness. And I think if that's the case, we're still in the dark. Many of you are in the dark. You have not been taught any of the history that has caused such problems for Indigenous people. But you see us here today. You saw the proud people out there marching for the earth, marching to protect a crazy industry that we have become addicted to and upon which the foundation of many economies is based upon and so many countries are competing for. What we see is a lack of respect for the inherent dignity of Indigenous people. What we see is that resistance will continue in a pandemic as construction and as colonization has never skipped a beat during this pandemic. There is a bill that is in front of the House of Commons, which is called Bill C-15, which is the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But I think that, I'm one of the first ones to say I don't trust government. I think they're liars. I think they will tell anybody anything as long as it helps them in the next election. But what we have declaration, I think, is far better than the Indian Act. It's a step forward. It's not a step back. And it is flawed for sure. It is not a perfect legislation, but I urge you to support Bill C-15, because this is what we need to do. We need to start moving forward, because as you can see, within this pandemic, our rights are being trampled on. We are scared for our health and safety within the pandemic. But I think we're even more afraid of losing even what we call colonization has stolen from us. So with that, I think I will end, and I can take some questions.